250 million acres or more of national forests, national parks, national monuments, national wildlife refuges. And in fact, he defined what we see as conservation, and he did protect the core. He made the connection, and he delivered on the land. Well, where are we today in making those connections, in protecting the core? Where are we in the transition of what Teddy Roosevelt did 100 years ago in his presidency that began 100 years ago this month? The Wilderness Act passed in 1964 with a vote of 99-1 in the Senate. How would that vote turn out today? And why? Most of the progressive conservation environmental legislation was signed by Republican presidents. And yet today, it seems as though conservatives are more often defined as anti-environment, anti-conservation. Why the rural-urban divide? Bush won most of rural America, about 2,400 of the nation's 3,100 counties, and Gore won 3-1 in the urban areas. Why that divide? And what can we do about it? Why the perception that it's economy versus the environment? What can we do to bring these two necessities together in the quality of life to protect that core that we have? Well, lots of good things are going on, and one of my frustrations as chief of the Forest Service was always there are so many good things going on that these 33,000 employees are involved in, and yet what was on my lap, on my desk, were difficult challenges like dealing with roadless, dealing with financial issues. I believe I was the only chief ever in history to have one hearing in front of 3 committee chairs at the same time on issues of accountability and financial management. Let me tell you, that'll get your attention. But there are many, many good things going on, and in a sense I feel politically that from the era of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, power was sort of gathering in Washington. We had a lot of legislation passed. We were shaping it and determining how to implement it. People like Bill Wharf was in it up to his neck when it came to wilderness, and many other issues. And now, starting about 1990, maybe the late 80s, the power is now emanating away from Washington, because if you ask yourself, in the era of the 90s, for example, what significant legislation was passed by Congress influencing conservation or the environment? In fact, many of the issues that agencies deal with and struggle with are a result of the inability of Congress to act. I mean, if Montana and Idaho would get on with their wilderness legislation and their wilderness package, we probably wouldn't have this roadless debate on the table. The agency is sort of stuck because other entities can't move or won't move or can't build a majority. And we continually see the balance of power shifting, and that makes some folks somewhat uncomfortable. But the fact is, the important thing is that we do lead on those kind of issues to make sure that we make the connection and protect the core. I want to switch gears now, and I just could not resist, particularly with the terrible events that happened on September 11, really reflecting back on history and how some tragedies really take us down paths that we don't realize. But what I'd like to talk about now is just spend a few minutes talking about what I believe are the Big Ten. The Big Ten conservation challenges in front of us here in the United States, but these transcend globally because we're not in an isolationist world. We can't hide from exotic species, some of these issues. And these 10 issues are no more than based upon my biases, my nearly quarter of a century in the trenches dealing with various issues. And I mentioned the 1872 mining law first. And I mention it first because it's perhaps the most vexing and outdated of all the U.S. natural resource laws. In fact, it's interesting to note that the 1872 mining law was passed before women could vote and before most minorities could vote. The country was struggling with Civil War reconstruction. St. Louis represented the frontier to most people. It was a law written by miners, for miners, because the country was busy doing something else, recovering from the Civil War. Another lesson of the kinds of things that can happen when the energy of the country is distracted on other issues. And the most phenomenal thing is the 1872 mining law has stood the test of time and was almost changed in the early 90s. Had Congress been in session perhaps another week or two, we were very close. Congress adjourned, and no change in 1872 mining law. Not only has it got antiquated royalty provisions, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but it still allows privatization of public lands for $2.50 to $5 an acre. Every other use, grazing, oil and gas, recreation, timber, is subject to approval or rejection by a field manager for environmental or safety reasons, all but hard rock mining. Stuart Udall left office in the late 60s saying that the 1872 mining law changing the 1872 mining law was one of the major needs that we have. And let's hope now that the current distractions that we have don't tempt those to open up the Rocky Mountain front. I want to talk a little bit about wildland fire, just to reflect back on some history as what I think is another one of the 10 challenges that we have. There's a lot to be learned from the Smokey Bear campaign. The Smokey Bear campaign was perhaps the most successful public information, public education campaign in the history of this country, maybe even the history of the world. Do you know that in 1968 more people knew who Smokey was than knew who the president was? In 1968, Smokey was the second most popular character, the second most recognized character in the United States. Do you know who the first one was? Santa Claus. Mickey Mouse was number 3. A tremendous public education campaign that really started, the real turning point in fire suppression occurred in 1910, which was a horrific year, sort of like last year was. And that's when we as a nation declared all-out war on every fire, everywhere, every time. By 1935, the Forest Service formally adopted a policy that all smokes were out by 10 a.m. They didn't matter where they were. And finally, in the 1960s, the 1970s, we began to appreciate the fact that fire was part of the ecosystem, that fire was a cleansing agent, just like wind and just like water. And we need to put fire back on the landscape. And the fact is that the forests evolved with fire. The forests are adapted to fire. It's our habitation that's not. And the particularly striking thing that I learned, and I spent, it seemed like a good share of my summer in either Idaho or Montana last year, is it really drove the point home that the single most important thing that you can do to protect your house is within 200 to 500 feet of that structure. The very most important thing, and if you don't have your property or buildings fireproofed, go back and do it. It's not very hard to do. That's so important. The urban wildland interface causes all of the firefighting community tremendous challenges, and the fact is that we've got the best wildland firefighters in the world, and a lot of them are trained right here in Missoula. The elite of the world firefighting workforce is trained, and many of them live right here. The fact is that now we have homes and subdivisions and houses all over the urban wildland interface. And it's not just the Rocky Mountain front, it's not just Lake Tahoe, it's not just the Cascades, it's not just the West Slope. It's basically all over the country. And for every structure that has to be protected in a wildland fire, the costs escalate tremendously. And it's a significant challenge. Not to mention the smoke and the air quality challenges, the challenges of the acceptance of prescribed fire in the right place at the right time, and yet you've got something that's very dangerous all the time, has to be respected. And the fact is that fire issues are interwoven with timber management policies and in certain areas with grazing management policies. And the fact is many of the most severe fires that occurred were slash fires after careless timber harvest. The Peshtigo fire in my home state, which remains the most devastating wildland fire in history, occurred in 1871. It was burning the same time as the Chicago fire, with 1,500 people losing their lives. It was a slash fire in a very dry year. And if anything, the whole fire issue should really be a reminder that this man over nature business really doesn't work very well. We don't manage ecosystems. We work within them. We may influence, we may tweak them somewhat, but the fact is the powers of Mother Nature are out there and they're very strong, and fire teaches us that very important lesson. And another issue I want to mention associated with fire is we come out of perhaps a culture and a budget structure that timber harvest paid the bills in much of the management. And in fact, the reason that some of the dog hair stands that develop after the old growth harvest with total fire suppression is really because the dollars aren't there, and the timber lobby and others lose interest in those tracts of land, and suddenly we have a conflagration like we had last year. And the fact is we need to make the right kind of investments in the land. And I hope we learn that as a society. My issue number 3 is water. And these are not in any sequence. And I believe of all the issues in this century, or perhaps this millennium, water is going to be the biggie. Now, if you take a look at the California energy crisis that we experienced earlier this year, and you replace the word energy with water, now you got a problem. We evolved as a species, without electricity. We can probably do okay, although it wouldn't be very convenient, and I'm certainly not advocating it. Now you try it without water, and you have a problem. And it's this tremendously valuable resource that we don't pay nearly as much attention to as a society as we should. And yet, if we look at the history books, this planet is littered with civilizations that disappeared as a result of poor land management practices and contamination or depletion of their water supplies. We look at the issues of desertification, the importance of keeping the vegetation on the land to maintain the cycles. It's so important. And yet we're the water planet. I mean, what did we see from outer space? This nice white and blue ball. Even the colors emanate from the water. But the fact is 97.5% of the water on planet Earth is salt water. We can't drink it. Most crops won't grow. Another 1.73% is locked up in glaciers in the Arctic and Antarctic as ice. And what we have of this water planet is 8/10,000ths of 1% that's usable, renewable water accessible to life on planet Earth. What are the key limiting factors as we look at challenges that face cities like Las Vegas, Scottsdale, Arizona, San Diego? Water. And the water issues are just not limited to the arid West, to desert areas. You go to Florida, you've got ocean water encroaching the freshwater prism because we're extracting it faster than it can replenish itself. Look at the Ogallala Aquifer that goes from South Dakota to Texas. We're extracting water at a rate 40 times faster than it's being replenished. And now in some areas, the Ogallala Aquifer is from 10 to 100 feet below historic levels. One generation, one day, is going to deal with this issue. The wars over water, the controversies over water. In Desert Storm, the Washington Post had a quote in 1991 that from an individual in the Mideast that says that if you think you have wars over oil, wait till you see the wars over water. And one of our challenges is to maintain watershed function, to restore watershed function wherever we can. And the fact is our forested landscapes, the 1/3 of the United States that forested produces 2/3 of the runoff. And it's, in a sense, to me, I view it's a travesty that we, as a society, with our $1.29 a pint bottles of water, we're acclimating a society not to expect good, clean water to come out of a tap. Think of the ramifications of a generation or two generations that won't demand fresh water out of a tap. Are we always going to be able to afford to pay $1.29 a pint? I mean, the stuff is more expensive than gasoline. Who would have dreamt of that 30 years ago? The National Forest, 192 million acres, we did an analysis. I had a team put together to take a look at the water values on National Forest. We talk a lot about board feet of timber and what they're worth. We talk about ounces of gold. We talk about tons of coal. Well, what about this water resource that we have? And in fact, the 192 million acres of National Forest provide drinking water for 60 million Americans in 33 states and about 400 communities. And the marginal value, the very minimal value of water running off a national forest is about $3.7 billion a year. And if we put economic values on water like we do other commodities, it would just blow everything sky high. There would be no comparison. And the fact is that the performance of every single land manager, state, county, federal, local, ought to be water quality. Would probably be the fairest measure, because within water quality, we see a reflection of the quality of the land management. Urban, rural, forest, agricultural is all reflected in water and what we do. The water, in a sense, is the circulatory system of what we do. I mentioned exotic species earlier. It's another issue that I believe is going to be a tremendously difficult issue for us to deal with, and the more we can be proactive versus reactive. I just think of the ramifications of exotic species so far. White pine blister rust, chestnut blight, changed the silvicultural makeup of the eastern hardwood forests. Kudzu, melaleuca in the Everglades, star thistle, sea lamprey, zebra mussel, white top, leafy spurge, Asian longhorn beetle. The list goes on and on and on. And the reality is we're really transporting millions of bacteria, viruses, spores, seeds, the germ plasm of lots of organisms around the world on a daily basis. And one of the interesting exercises that we were involved in a couple of years ago was to take a look at, what are some of the big social issues or the big demographic issues that are going to face us in this century that we may not be thinking about. And part of that exercise was to look at some of the things that people 100 years ago were concerned about. And there was actually a conference held around 1900 that talked about some predictions. And they got a lot of things right. The speed of computation, they didn't guess the internet. Talked about population growth, talked about increased nutrition, medical care. Well, one thing they missed that has changed the face of how we interact with the world as a species is the rate of travel. And at that time, they predicted that lightning speed for the human species around the globe might be 50 miles an hour. And here we are circling the globe at faster than the speed of sound. And if you go out in outer space, it can be a lot faster than that. We've recreated Pangea, in a sense, with our transportation systems. And we've really, in a sense, thrust the world into a evolutionary high gear as species compete with one another and are thrust into vacant niches. And the interesting thing is, you know what our best defense against exotic species is? It's protecting the core. Our wilderness areas, our roadless areas, our undisturbed areas, these are the bulwarks, the areas that are most resistant to infestation of exotic species. And obviously we need to be vigilant with our inspections, with our standards. We need to make sure that our research is directed in a proactive manner so we understand the life histories of species before they're on our shores, and then we have to deal with them. I want to talk a little bit about land fragmentation. And these issues are really all intertwined, but it's another challenge that we have in this prosperous society, in this prosperous country that we have today. If we think about the fact that the city of Atlanta has sprawled over 400,000 acres of rich forest land in the southeast. The number of tracts of forest land, 50 acres or less, from 1998 to 1994 doubled. The rate of development in the 1990s was double the rate of development of farmland, wetland, forest land, was double the earlier decade. As Will Rogers said, buy land, they ain't making it anymore. And as we diminish our tract size, we lose a lot of our flexibilities, and that's so important. We're loving our parks to death. Our 104 million acre congressionally designated wilderness preservation system does not have a complete representation of all the ecosystems yet. It's a lot of rock and ice and areas that were inaccessible. We need to think of our bottomland hardwoods. We need to think about our tall grass prairies and other ecosystems. In fact, on the way out here, and Julia, you might mention this, I was reading a Round River that Rick Swanson gave me in 1994. I'm finally getting to it. And I was reading what Aldo Leopold was writing about during World War II to kind of get a feel for the time that we're in. And one of the things that he talked about back then in one of the wilderness articles, in fact, Bill, you probably know which one it is. It's only about a page and a half long, but he talked about the most valuable use of wilderness to society is this is our library of what it was like. And at that time, what he was doing, one of the things he was doing is trying to fight the harvest of the Porcupine Mountains in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that was basically a virgin maple forest. And with the war effort and the demand for timber, that was threatened, and yet because of his influence and some other things, they managed to protect at least part of the Porcupine Mountains in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. If you haven't been there, I recommend it. It's a nice place to be. One of my favorite quotes of Leopold's is that he said 50 years from now, the acquisition of public game lands may be recognized as a milestone in the evolution of democratic government. And I think as we look at what we have today, that has proven to be true. And I think about the era of the devolution of public land management in 1994. In fact, I was sitting on the stage with Jack Ward Thomas in Chattanooga, Tennessee at the Outdoor Writers Conference when Jack extemporaneously basically said, is he for devolution of public land? Is not only no, but hell no, this resource that we have. And those that were proponents of devolution of public land quickly backpedaled. And it wasn't the extreme enviro groups, as some would put it, that were opposing it. It was the Billings Rod and Gun Club and people that were concerned about access to public land. Places where I grew up, it's almost impossible now to trade out of public land, no matter how small the piece is, because somebody that lives there hunts on it or fishes on it or hikes on it, and they want to have continued access to that tract of land. I want to, I've only got a few more. Old growth forests and grasslands, but primarily old growth forest. This issue probably symbolizes the forest management debate more than anything else. The spotted owl issue was really about old growth and a nation coming to grips with how much old growth do we want to have left? How much do we keep? My home state of Wisconsin, the state tree, Michigan, the white pine, old growth white pine forest ecosystems don't exist. Are we ever going to have it? And yet this is virtually the tree that built America that people